focus questions. And the last focus question that we can get to was, how does the Revolutionary War impact African Americans, women, and American Indians? And all three of those groups are going to be directly impacted by the American Revolution in one way, shape, or form. African Americans, to include free blacks and African American slaves, are going to be greatly, dramatically affected by the outcome of the revolution. Women, American women, black and white, are going to also be affected by the outcome of the revolution. And Native Americans, to focus on Native Americans, we'll talk about them later this week and next. Native Americans really lost out during the American Revolution. They did not support just one side. Some tribes supported the British, some tribes supported the American colonists. But when the war is over in 1783 and the Treaty of Paris is signed, basically with the colonies, with the United States winning the territory, Native Americans were largely left out of the treaty. And furthermore, what's going to happen after the war is won is going to be a period of westward expansion across the continent, in which Native Americans are literally going to be pushed and shoved and forced off of their lands to make way for settlement west. Haley.
I thought you were going to ask a question.
Okay. So those are the 5 focus questions. Now, when we do a PowerPoint lesson, again, we're working up chapter 5 for the rest of this week and next week. All right. You should have chapter 5 read for tomorrow. You have your vocab quizzes tomorrow. Next week is your vocab quiz on chapter 5, Friday the 13th. And your inquisitive assignment for chapter 5 is due next Friday as well. All right, your inquisitive assignment is due. Let's talk about George Washington. And we're going to go, what I would recommend when we're doing a PowerPoint lesson, if you guys could have your PowerPoints out. And are you familiar with the Cornell Notes format for notes? Okay. If you're familiar with Cornell Notes, some students are comfortable doing Cornell Notes on a daily basis when we do a lecture and notes. Some students use the PowerPoint slides to jot the notes down, because occasionally I'll stop and put a note on the board. Whatever is comfortable for you, you can use Cornell Notes on a separate sheet of paper or in a notebook, or you can put your notes on. I leave room on most of the slides, underneath the slides, to add notes. We're going to take a look today at an overview of this chapter, and we're going to start with our author videos. The textbook that you've been using is written by this man here, who is an absolute USA historical genius, David Shee. And for important topics, we import and I use his video clips, which again, we watch them in class, but I also link them on the Google Classroom site. So if you miss class for a reason, please watch the video clips that kind of supplement what we're doing in class. We're going to take a look at Washington. What do we know about Washington before we look at the video? Haley, what do we know offhand before we even start class? First president. Honor. Another factoid about first president. He was the Revolutionary War general. He led the Continental Army. He was named the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And when the war started, Washington was not an exceptionally talented soldier or leader, but he became both as the war progressed. He became both. What else do we know? He what? He had more hair than I had. He also had wooden teeth. Washington had wooden false teeth. He lost his teeth. Here's a historical fact. Most Americans, because of the quality of dental care, the non-quality of dental care, and the knowledge, the lack of knowledge about dental hygiene, most Americans would lose their teeth by their late 20s, early 30s, men and women. And Washington was fitted with a full set of wooden dentures at some point in his middle age. And those dentures are actually on display, I think, at the Smithsonian or the Washington, at Washington Mansion. You had a question, Liz? He was a plantation owner. He was a slaveholder from Virginia. He died in 1799, and on his deathbed, I want you to think about this for a second. This is a thought-provoking comment, thought-provoking question. On Washington, a slave owner, Washington was a slaveholder, owned dozens of slaves, very wealthy Virginian. On his deathbed, he died a really horrible death. He had a throat cancer. A couple of weeks before Christmas of 1799, Washington dies. And on his deathbed, he instructs his wife, Martha, to free the vast majority of his slaves. Now, my question for you is, what does Washington's instructions to his wife on his deathbed suggest about the slaveholding president's attitudes about slavery? If he owned slaves, and he did, he sold slaves, and he did, why did he instruct his wife to sell his slaves or free his slaves? He didn't instruct her to sell. He instructed her to free. Why would he do that, Palin? Yeah, many Americans recognized, even in 1799, many Americans recognized the immorality of slavery. They recognized that treating African Americans as property, while done in every southern state, in every southern colony, many people still recognized it was morally wrong. And Washington is one of a good example of a number of people, famous and not so famous, who on their deathbed or in their wills instructed their slaves to be free. It didn't happen all the time. It wasn't frequent, but there are plenty of examples of people who did it, Washington being one. Let's take a look at our author's video on George Washington.
Once the American Revolutionary War erupted, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as the commander-in-chief. It was both an obvious and an unlikely choice in that it was obvious because George Washington had about the most experience as a militia leader of anyone in the colonies. On the other hand, he had never commanded a large number of troops. He had never dealt with artillery, cannons. So he had very little experience compared to the British generals that he was facing. And, not surprisingly, in the early months of the war, the Americans suffered a sequence of setbacks. In fact, the situation looked so dismal after a year that Washington was concerned that they could even continue to fight. Many of his soldiers went back home. They deserted, they left. It was very difficult for him to sustain an ongoing army. And yet over time, not so much because of his experience as a military leader, but rather because of his innate virtues, he was able to sustain a campaign against the British armies that both outnumbered and out-equipped the American forces. Perhaps the most important thing that Washington learned was that he didn't have to beat the British every battle. He simply had not to lose. If he could prolong the war long enough, he knew that the British would be hard-pressed to continue to supply 30,000 soldiers and hundreds of British ships that were fighting the war in America, 3,000 miles from London. That became more and more difficult for the British, and eventually, along with the French aid, the Americans prevailed. Not because Washington was a better tactical leader, but because he was an inspiring leader.
We talked a little bit about those ideas yesterday. When the war is fought, the American colonists are outnumbered, they are outgunned, they are not as well trained. But Washington's game plan is to basically force the British to fight over long periods of time, eventually hoping that they'll wear down. And as Washington became more experience as a general. As 1775 turned into 1777, 1778, Washington gained a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom, and became very inspiring. He was not like the best tactical decision maker, but he was an inspiring leader. Men would walk through a brick wall for George Washington. Soldiers would fight very loyally for Washington. All right, let's continue on and look at American society during the war. Is this what page is this in your PowerPoint, girls and guys? This is page 1 at the bottom. Page 4. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about choosing sides. We're not going to look at every bit of writing down below, but I want to talk about the bullet points that appear in American society at war. We said yesterday that the war was fought as a civil war. And it was a civil war because it involved fighting between English citizens from the United Kingdom, from overseas in Europe, and English citizens who happened to be American colonists in North America. So it was a civil war. Fighting occurred between father and son, between brother and brother, between sometimes son and grandfather in some instances. It was a war that divided the colonists greatly. And if you look over on the right, I've got a little pie chart to tell you how it shook out in terms of who supported who during the colonies. The way it breaks down, and it's not really the best, the way it breaks down, 1/3 of the colonists were patriots who supported the American colonists, who supported George Washington and the Continental Army. One side would be considered Tories or loyalists. These would be people who believed that the British should maintain control of the colonies and that the colonies were wrong for declaring their independence. And the other group is going to be what? They're labeled as U. If you supported the Patriots, you supported the English. If you didn't support either one, you were probably U. Somebody help me. Yeah, undecided. And these were people who really didn't have a stake in the outcome, who might live outside of large cities, who were not aware of the fighting that was going on as the war progressed. The undecided vote would be about 1/3 of the American colonists. Now, that undecided vote, or that undecided group, is going to shift as the war rages on. As we get closer to the end of the war, more and more people who are undecided are going to come to side with the Patriots, and we'll talk about why. It's also a world war, okay? It's also a world war, and here's why. It's a world war because it involved Great Britain, it involved the U.S., and France, Spain, and the Netherlands will also become allies to the United States. It's going to be a world war because France, Spain, and the Netherlands, primarily France. France is the most significant of the three. France's help is going to help the United States eventually win the war when they officially become our ally. But Spain and the Netherlands also assisted. Okay, not to the extent the French did, but Spain and the Netherlands and Holland, okay, they are going to help as well. Spain and the Netherlands, and even France to a great degree. Why would those three European countries want to sign on with the Americans in their battle, Liz, against the British? Yeah. Yeah. Those countries were enemies of Great Britain. Those countries were enemies. France and Great Britain had a long series of wars going back. Spain hated England, and England hated Spain. So the allies that the United States gets are not only looking to help the United States, but they're also trying to kind of get a little payback at their hated rival, Great Britain from Europe. So that's kind of motivating those three countries. So the United States against Great Britain, but along with the U.S., they have three allies, and I'm going to number them 1, 2, and 3 in the order of support. Not, I didn't say the order of importance, but in the order of support that those countries gave. It would be France, Spain, and then the Netherlands in terms of how much help they provided the American colonies. I'm going to take a quick look at the next author video, and this is going to be on the Revolution as a Civil War.
The American Revolution was as much a civil war as it was a battle between American patriots and the British Army. Many families split over the war. Some were patriots, or Whigs as they were also called. Others were loyalists, or Tories as they were called. Some 20% of the colonists were loyalists who opposed the war, who opposed the idea of independence. At the Battle of Kings Mountain in North Carolina, for example, dozens of family members fought on opposite sides during the war, and in fact, brothers killed brothers in that battle. At the same time, Native American tribes allied themselves with each side, and some changed during the war itself, changed sides. So too, African Americans, whether they were enslaved or free, they also faced difficult choices of choosing which side to support. Some joined the British Army and gained their freedom. Others supported the American Revolution. Many others tried to remain neutral. So the Revolution itself was a very complicated civil war at the same time that it was a war for independence.
All right, any questions on the Revolution as a civil war? Talk about the role African Americans played as soldiers. We'll get to that in a little bit. The author talked a little bit about that. Britain, as a way to encourage African Americans to help their army, Britain guaranteed slaves their freedom if they left their plantation and joined them to fight for the British. That was a very, very tempting opportunity for people who lived as slaves to basically, say, if we fight for the British and the British win, we could earn our freedom. On the other hand, George Washington and the Continental Army at the beginning was reluctant to allow African American soldiers to serve, and African Americans will not fight for the American colonies or the United States until it was determined that they needed the manpower as the war progressed on. More on that coming up, okay? All right, let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about British military power. Mobilizing for war. How the United States gets ready, okay? Anna, would the United States in 1775, when the war starts, would the United States have been in a good position to win a war against Great Britain? No. Absolutely not. And the most important reason is, there was probably two. Britain had the most powerful and best trained army and navy in the world in terms of manpower and ships. And they were the best trained and best equipped, bar none. And the United States in 1775 did not have a professional army. The United States Army consisted of 13 separate what? Militias. 13 separate state militias. And militia members were volunteers. They were teachers, they were doctors, they were lawyers, they were tradesmen, they were middle-class workers. They might have been indentured servants or free African Americans. They were not professional soldiers. So British military power is by far has the advantage at the start of the war. And that's going to be a big obstacle for the colonists to have to overcome. The Continental Army was not yet established in 1775. The militia force was not terribly well organized. Militias were designed not to fight on a continent. Militias were designed to fight and protect individual what? States and colonies. So Washington recognizes immediately, I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, but Washington recognizes immediately that in order to beat England, in order to beat the British in the Revolution, he has to have a 24/7 professional army. And that's what's going to be established, and he will become commander-in-chief. He'll be named basically the field leader of the Continental Army. When we see the term Continental Army, we are referring to professional soldiers who are paid and trained 24/7. That's all they do. Okay, that's who the British were using as sailors and soldiers, professionals. The United States had to have that, and Washington made that his priority. Okay, the militias and the Continental Army will fight together. Now, another area is the problems of finance and supply. Britain is going to have serious issues feeding and supplying their army. The colonies, the states, are going to have a difficulty paying their soldiers and paying for supplies because the national government, okay, that is established under the Declaration of Independence and under the Articles of Confederation, they don't have a lot of what? Money. There's not a lot of money. So there's going to be issues. One of the problems that American soldiers are going to have, many American soldiers are going to go long periods of time without getting paid, and many American soldiers are not going to go, are going to go a long period of time maybe without proper food and clothing because the government had difficulty financing. Now, the problems would be worked out. Washington and his leadership would improve things as the war went on, but this makes the early going of the war very, very challenging. How do you train and get equipment for thousands of professional soldiers without cash? You're basically having to promise to pay for items later once the government has the money. So they're basically signing promissory notes to maybe manufacturers of weapons, saying, hey, when we get the money, when our country gets on its feet, we'll get you paid. But for right now, we need 5,000 muskets for our soldiers in Massachusetts. Okay, so these are going to be challenges. Now, Native Americans and the Revolution are going to play a pretty important role with both sides. I have this to say on this slide before we go any further. I want you to look at Native Americans and the Revolution. And Dylan, I said that Indian tribes typically, their support was sometimes for the British and sometimes for the Americans. Why would the Native Americans, majority at least, side with the British in the Revolution as opposed to siding with the Americans?
Because maybe the British promised like that they wouldn't go past like a certain area. So
Exactly correct. The British basically were less threats to taking and conquering Native American lands. And most Native American tribes that sided with the British were siding with the British because the British posed less of a threat to them. They weren't too jazzed about either side, really, but if they had to choose, most Native Americans are going to choose siding with the British because the British pose less of a threat. And it will bear out to be pretty reasonable that the Native Americans felt that, because what's going to happen after the Revolution, after the colonies win and gain their independence, what do we know is a large part of the story of Native Americans after that point?
they get pushed out.
Yeah, the story of Native Americans is going to be one of constant being relocated and forced to move, and westward expansion across the continent, broken promises, broken treaties on the parts of Americans. So the Native Americans are going to be a big loser with a capital L when the Revolution ends. But they supported both sides. There's also a mention in your reading, the United States hoped to, during the Revolution, conquer Canada. Okay, they hoped to conquer Canada, but the disaster in Canada refers to the American entry into the area north of the Great Lakes. And you're reading, if you're that far in your reading, what was the sickness that basically cast a smallpox epidemic really affected the American army, which resulted in a disaster in Canada. So this is how the United States is mobilizing for war, and that term mobilizing means getting ready to fight. Getting ready to fight. Mobilizing for war, how they're getting ready to fight. Questions? Some Native Americans fought with the colonists. There was a tribe, the Mohicans, not the Mohicans, the Mohicans from Massachusetts. They fought along with the Americans. Matter of fact, they had their own group of soldiers, their own regiment of soldiers, and they professed loyalty to the American colonists. But generally speaking, Indian tribes tended to side with the British. okay, because the British posed less of a threat. How many of you are familiar with the phrase, you pick the lesser of two evils? Familiar with that? If you pick the lesser of two evils, you're basically saying you're going to take the thing that's going to cause the least what on it? Least damage, least problems. And the Native Americans siding with the British was focused primarily on them making the decision that they felt the British were the lesser of two evils. We've got an author video on this page as well. Let's go to that. The challenges of the
When actual
war.
fighting broke out in 1775 between American revolutionaries and British armies, no one in the world thought that the Americans had a chance against the great British Empire. And yet both sides had real challenges in conducting the American Revolutionary War. The British, for example, were fighting far from home. It was very difficult to communicate with the government at the same time that they were fighting a war in America. Their generals made tactical mistakes, often failing to follow up on victories by defeating the Americans completely. The Americans, on the other hand, they had no army, they had no navy, they had no government when the fighting broke out. They had to find weapons, they had to get cannons, they had to find gunpowder. They also, of course, were primarily farmers. And so farmers suddenly overnight had to become soldiers. And that required training, and that required discipline, and that required leadership, none of which they had in great numbers. So both sides faced tremendous challenges as the war began. And in both cases, they adapted as the war unfolded to deal with those challenges.
Do you have any of you have any soldiers in your family? Soldiers, Liz, I know you've got soldiers in yours. Taylor? If soldiers don't adapt, if leaders in armies and navies don't adapt to problems, they'll become doomed to failure. And what's going to happen is Washington is going to have to adapt, and he's successful in adapting and changing the way he fights. The British struggled in adapting, number one, because they didn't know the geography, they didn't know the land very well, and they were used to fighting in a manner that was completely different from the way that the colonists, the American colonies, were going to fight. We'll talk more about how British soldiers fought in a moment, but let's move through. We're making some good progress. Let's continue on the next slide. What slide number are we up to? 6? All right, let's look at 6 and talk about what happens at Long Island in 1776. All right, so the beginning of the war, I'm going to give you the most important early battles before we get to this point. The war breaks out at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts in 1775. The British are looking to get to an ammunition depot, a weapons depot, to capture American ammunition, American guns. They heard that the colonists are storing weapons outside a storage area in Lexington and Concord. So the British send armed troops, and Paul Revere makes his famous ride, and he's screaming across the countryside at midnight, the regulars are coming, meaning the British soldiers are on their way. And that alerts the countryside, and the colonists show up with their muskets, and what happens? There's a couple of skirmishes. There's one skirmish at Lexington. There's a number of injured. There's a number killed. And then the British soldiers move on to Concord, where at Concord, we're going to see the American colonists put up much more stronger of a fight on April 19, 1775, and they're basically going to force the British to hightail it back to Boston, and the American colonists are chasing them literally from Concord back to Boston as the British soldiers are running through the woods, getting shot at from people behind trees, from inside homes, from behind rock walls. What type of tactics, by the way, are those? Okay. Guerrilla tactics, hit and run. Okay. This is the type of tactic that the British were not really exposed to. They were not used to fighting with people shooting at them from behind obstacles and behind fence lines and behind trees. British, quite honestly, and most European armies were used to lining up and fighting in an open battlefield, shoulder to shoulder, with their muskets pointed down range. And when the fighting was over, whatever army had the what? The most people still standing. And the British had to adapt to the American tactics. Now, in 1776, all right, the year after the war starts in April in Lexington and Concord, what time do we go till? 2:15? The British, in the summer of 1776, begin an attack on New York City, begin an attack on Long Island. And they send an incredibly large, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they send an incredibly large flotilla of ships to attack New York City. And this is where Thomas Paine is going to come into play as important writing of his number 2. His first and probably most important piece of writing was what document that encouraged independence? Common Sense. His second most important document, and you probably see this on the Regents in one form or another, he wrote a second document, Paine did, to basically rally the troops in 1776 to help pick up their spirits because morale was in the toilet for the Americans in 1776. They were losing battles. New York had just been conquered. The British forced Washington to escape under cover of night and cover of rain. Americans are very, very despondent, and the Army especially, the American Army, is at near its breaking point. So Thomas Paine, who penned Common Sense, the treatise on why the Americans should declare their independence, Thomas Paine writes another article called The Times That Try Men's Souls. And basically, he was writing to encourage and to promote the idea that we have to stick this out, we have to keep fighting, we have to win this, we can't give up. General Washington was so impressed with Paine's article that he basically required it be read to the troops in formation. And it did an incredible job of helping to lift the spirits of the soldiers at a time when their spirits were really, really low. When we talk about armies, girls and guys, I used that word a moment ago. I should write it down. When we talk about morale, what are we, Katie, talking about? If morale is good or morale is low, what are we speaking about?
The confidence.
Yeah. Morale is your degree that you're confident, the degree that you feel good about your chances, the degree that you feel like you can accomplish something. What's kind of frightening about this, in 1776, the war could have been won by the British. The war could have been won had they not made the tactical mistake of not chasing after George Washington when he escaped in 1776. But if you think about morale, who should really have the low morale in a battle where you're traveling to fight 3,000 miles from home? Haley. The British, they're stronger, they're tougher, they got better equipment, but they're fighting 3,000 miles from home in a land that they're not used to, on a territory that they're not accustomed to. It's hot, it's humid during a lot of times that they're fighting. British soldiers, and American soldiers for that matter, were not dressed for the climate. What was the major material in a soldier's uniform, whether it was December or the height of July? Wool. Okay? And wool, ladies and gentlemen, in 90-degree, 100-degree heat, is basically going to cause you to become dehydrated. So you would think morale would be low for the British. It wasn't the case. Morale was bad for the Americans in 1776 until Thomas Paine's The Times That Try Men's Souls. We'll pick up on that topic tomorrow.
I think we get out at 13.
What?
We might get out at 13.
Everybody have a good day.
You want to watch football tonight, Mr. Carter?
Who's playing tonight? College tonight, right?
No, it's Chiefs Ravens.
Oh.
NFL said